For those who don't know, my name is Adam Shalom. I have been attending CSGO conferences off and on since I was 13, so quite a while. And I have two roles connected to our broader movement. I'm the rabbi of a humanistic congregation in the north suburbs of Chicago called Kol Hadash, and I'm also the dean for North America of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which trains leaders, life cycle ceremony officiants, and rabbis for humanistic and secular Jewish communities in North America. We also publish materials, do classes, and do adult education programs too, which is why I'm happy to be able to zoom into this CSGO conference this weekend and offer this session on social justice and the Hebrew Bible. Now, you might have noticed when you looked at the title, there's a question mark at the end of that. Social justice and the Hebrew Bible? Because it's not something you would automatically assume are synonymous. Or perhaps you might assume they're totally synonymous given recent rhetoric by an organization or a loose organization of thinkers that are sometimes called the religious left. And we'll talk about them in just a moment. But the reason why you might not have thought of the Hebrew Bible as a source of social justice is because historically, people on the left felt the Bible was a reactionary document because it represented establishment traditional religion. After all, remember the classic line of Karl Marx about religion. Religion is the opiate of the masses. And what do opiates do? They leave you in a stupor. They make you passive. They stop you from standing up for yourself and from resisting oppression. So the Hebrew Bible was seen as a tool of the establishment and to get people to accept their fate in hopes of some kind of cosmic reward rather than fighting for earthly rewards and justice in this world, which is the whole point of social justice. It's not to wait for God to make it right in the next world. It's for us to make it right here and now, which is why it also has a strong appeal to secular and humanistic Jews. In the American context, when we think about the Bible, we think about it being used by people we used to call Bible thumpers, the religious right, the megachurches, the people who are deploying the Bible to condemn same-sex identity and attraction, who are insisting on traditional marriage using their phrase. Not that they're actually reading what traditional marriage is about, because if they actually read the Bible carefully, traditional marriage is polygamy and about property and not about consent and not about love and happening in childhood and all kinds of other terrible things that, well, that's not what I meant by traditional marriage, but that's not what they mean either. They're imposing their values using the Bible as a tool to do that. So what you see out on the street in recent protests in the last 10 years or so are people who call themselves the religious left. You might recognize Cornel West in the front row of this row of protesters, but you also see a lot of clergy in their clergy garb with their sashes and regalia. Now, this is actually not new. There have been religious people involved in social justice protests for a long time. Think about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference during the Civil Rights era, and ministers and priests getting involved in the anti-Vietnam War effort. So it's not new to have religious people involved on so-called left public causes, but it's taken on a particular overtone in recent years because of the rise of the religious right. So this is seen as sort of a counteraction to make the claim that religion does not only choose one side. I remember in the early 2000s when we were debating the legality of same-sex marriage, there were a number of amicus briefs filed by left-wing religious organizations, Reformed Jewish Action Center and other things, that said that by not allowing gay marriage, you were restricting our religious freedom because our tradition would affirm and celebrate these partnerships, and you've now not allowed us to do that with the label and the sort of kosher stamp of the government for same-sex partners. So this was trying to use the religious liberty argument, but in another direction. I mean, it's sort of the same thing that the Satanist Church or the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster tries to do, where they take the idea and the language of religious liberty and teach all the stories and push it to a somewhat absurd extreme to make the point that it's going too far. But it's using the language of religion. Another example is the Poor People's Campaign led by William Barber II, whom you see here, who's a minister, I believe, in North Carolina. Now he has a faculty position at Yale University's Divinity School. He's also seen as one of the leaders in this religious left world. And there are plenty of rabbis who've gotten involved in this as well. This is a protest that was organized by an organization called Tru'ah. If you recognize that word Tru'ah, it comes from the high holidays. On Rosh Hashanah, one of the sounds of the shofar is Tru'ah. Um, and you can see someone holding one of their slogans on a placard there, resisting tyrants since Pharaoh. It became very popular during the Trump era. But you see people here in Jewish religious garb, including a talis prayer shawl, kippah, the head covering, and they're using religious language to motivate political action. You see another placard there says every vote is sacred. So their argument is that it's a religious duty to stand up for this particular approach. So I thought what I would do today is talk specifically about the Hebrew Bible and how it is deployed in social justice arguments and what we think about that. Because after all, secular and humanistic Jews have a particular approach to the Hebrew Bible. We think it was written by people, not by a God. We think it was written over time and not all at once in the divine mind. In fact, the form in which we see the Bible as one volume is misleading because it was actually not a book, it was the books, a collection of them written over many centuries with different viewpoints and perspectives and values. So when you're talking about quoting the Bible as if it's one unified entity, that doesn't reflect how it actually came to be. It's an anthology, not a one volume composition. And as secular Jews, we're allowed to disagree with the Bible. That's the whole point of being secular, is not accepting something on religious authority. So there may be times where there's passages in the Bible that we like, but there may be passages that we don't like. And there may be passages even that we are offended by. And if that's the case, then we have to ask the question, which we'll talk about today, of what do we do with this source if it's flawed, if it has some things we like and some things we don't like. Some of you may know that in recent years, the writer Roald Dahl has been exposed as an anti-Semite and an unambiguous anti-Semite. I mean, you read some of the stuff he's written, and there's no massaging it. And so then the question becomes, what do we do with that? Do we take beloved stories and say, forget it, they're gone? I mean, there's a debate right now over do we go back and edit them to take out some of the nasty stuff that he included, the language that we wouldn't use today about people who are quote overweight or who are quote unattractive based on certain standards. That was part of his language writing in the 50s and 60s that we might not accept today. So some people are going back and editing those books for sensitivities. Others are appalled at editing the books for sensitivities. But in Dahl's case, he explicitly was anti-Semitic. And do we, quote, cancel his books? Do we not use them at all? Well, what about the Hebrew Bible, which has wonderful stuff and terrible stuff, and we'll see some of both. It's not so easy for us who are willing to accept this as a human authored book to simply apologize away or forgive the more problematic material. So I do want to offer a content warning that some of the stories that we'll be looking at, or legal passages, include condemnation of things that we would accept. Same-sex attraction, the treatment of women is certainly not up to snuff. So we'll just have to understand that this challenging material is in here. I have not edited for sensitivities, but I just wanted to give that warning at the outset that there is some discussion. And I've not even included the worst stuff in regards to violence against women or against non-Jews and so on. So it is there. You should know. Look, the way to put it simply is the Bible is not a book for kids. Okay, what we're going to do first is do sort of a case study of Leviticus 19. And I want to actually change the video view so I can see people if they have comments to offer. Because we're going to take a look at some of the passages in Leviticus 19 that are often deployed for social justice inspiration, talk about how those might apply, and then get some more context for where they appear. So here's the first passage. This shows up in a lot of social justice discussions. When you reap the harvest of your land, you will not wholly reap the corners of your field, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. You will not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You will leave them for the poor and for the foreigner or the stranger. Now, just to clarify what this means, when you're harvesting a field with oxen and you turn the corner of the field, there's going to be a little carve out. Like if you have a circle inside of a square, there's that little corner piece that you're not going to be able to harvest. And what this is saying is you don't go back and make sure to do that. Or when you're chopping the wheat stalks and some of the grains fall out of the head of the wheat and hit the ground, that's gleaning, where you would go back and pick up everything off the ground. Or the vineyard, if you've harvested the grapes and a few grapes fall on the ground, don't go back and pick up everything off the ground. Leave those pieces for the what is described here as the poor and the stranger, the person who's not part of your community. Sometimes in other passages in the Bible, this refers to the widow, the orphan, people who are in a vulnerable position. So my first question is, I'm interested in your reactions to this. What might be current social justice issues that you would apply this passage to, or that this passage could be used to reinforce?
You gotta get a little louder.
Food insecurity.
Food insecurity, okay?
People seeking asylum.
Maybe asylum seekers, because it's talking about the stranger, the foreigner.
Tax code.
I didn't catch that last one.
Oh, I said the tax code in terms of
Sure.
wanting to be able to keep all their money and not give it back to the government taxes to support social services and other much needed for those who are more vulnerable.
Okay. Yeah, because every harvest is going to include some corners and some gleaning, and do you really need that? And part of the point is, if you own the field, no, maybe you don't need every last piece of something that's grown there. And this is describing a collective responsibility, right? That there is a social, not just a safety net for the poor and the stranger, but that there is a sense of responsibility for the welfare of the poor and the stranger. That you are not allowed to simply ignore them and take what's mine, mine, mine. There's also a sense of ours and giving to others. Any other thoughts and issues this might apply to?
You say refugees.
Yeah, refugees, asylum,
Asylum seekers, foreigners.
Homeless.
maybe the homeless. Yeah. I even had one bat mitzvah student who used it as a taking off point for donations, of used clothing, food, food you don't need, that kind of thing. Again, you can ask yourself, what are the gleanings of my closet? What are the gleanings of the toys we're not using anymore? What can someone else do with something that I don't need, but they could use and make something out of? I mean, honestly, even the idea of free cycle, where I don't need it, maybe someone else can use it. I'll put it on my porch. Someone else picks it up. So there's all kinds of messages or applications for this particular principle of gleaning and allowing the people who need it to take something that they need. And honestly, part of the point is also, you've just harvested the whole thing. Do you need those last little pieces? Maybe not. Okay, so this is a very popular passage deployed for social justice purposes. Another series of rules. You shall not steal, you shall not lie, you shall not deceive one another, you will not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of your God. You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. I'm a particular fan of that last one. So again, what are some social justice issues that might come out of these principles?
Fair pay.
Okay. Fair pay, a living wage. Have you heard of the issue called wage theft, where workers have their pay withheld to force them to work more, or sometimes they never receive it, or get a mandatory overtime that they don't get paid? And so this whole point that when you hire someone, they're entitled to their money that day, when it's due, so that they are not your servant who has to come back the next day because you've held their wages and forced them to come back to you, so they can't go to another job or opportunity. So not just not robbing your neighbor or not stealing or not lying to them in an employment dynamic, but also specifically with employment that their wages are theirs, not yours, as the employer, and so you need to pay them promptly and completely. So this is a definite application to the whole concept of wage theft. And I like the fact, honestly, that my tradition was aware of this issue and wrote a law saying you can't do that. And this is, probably composed in its final form around 2,500 years ago. It may have roots even earlier. So it's wonderful that our tradition has this value included in it. Okay. The next one. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind. You will do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor show favoritism to the great, but you will judge your neighbor in righteousness. So here's a case where, sorry, just adjust the video here. There's a sense of disability rights, right? Talking about the deaf, the blind, to not add barriers to them. Again, I had a bat mitzvah student who had this passage who talked about disability access and universal design and read a series of stories about children with disability and talked about how those characters are presented in the narratives. Other examples that you might pull out of this one.
That last one's really very much about kind of just being fair and just treating people equally regardless of their standing in society.
Mm-hmm. And especially justice, right?
Looking at that and then looking at the application of law of criminal justice in America, gives lie to the notion that we're Christian nation. Anyway.
I think there's another layer.
Yeah, so the idea of impartial justice, interesting that you shouldn't automatically have sympathy for the poor either, according to this, that you simply judge based on the facts. Blind justice is an ideal that's very hard to achieve. And as we've seen in recent protests, a lot of them have been around criminal justice and the justice system, in particular, either being favorable to the rich or being particularly oppressive to the poor, cash bail, all kinds of issues like that are cases where rich and poor create different justice.
When it says you shall not be partial to the poor, it makes me think of, I guess, the difference between the attitudes of someone giving charity and someone fighting for justice. Like being patronizing to the poor, a lot of people think that's the right way to treat people who are poor, as opposed to treating people with dignity.
Interesting. Because if you assume they've been wronged, or you assume that they're in need of help, the poor little things, then
Right.
that's also problematic. Good. Okay.
Adam,
Yeah.
I think Dave tried to jump in at one point too.
Oh, sorry. I can't see the chat while I've got the screen open. So, Dave,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just saying that the part about the stumbling block before the blind and the cursing before the deaf is kind of interesting, because the blind cannot see, the deaf cannot hear the curses. So I think there's kind of some other layer there that's more general, that it's getting at, not just disability, but you don't use somebody's weakness to defeat them simply because they have a weakness.
Very good. Or take advantage of them in a way that they can't understand what's going on. Yes, absolutely. So there's a sort of broader moral message of compassion, of affirming human dignity, even of even of people with limitations. Put it that way. These are larger issues. So then the last part we'll look at in this section: you will not go around as a slanderer among people. You will not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. You will not hate your brother in your heart. You will rebuke your neighbor and not bear any sin because of him. You will not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you will love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. That's the name of the God. So what issues come out of this passage?
I mean, it's effectively a call to empathy.
Call to empathy, sure.
But also, you can't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, so it's a call to action. You just can't be a spectator when other people are in trouble.
Right. There's a positive obligation to intervene.
Right.
So you can think about, people getting harassed on public transit, or racism against a community that doesn't happen to be your own. This is a call to say you can't stand by. You have to act, even if it's your neighbor, because guess what? You have to love your neighbor as yourself, even if your neighbor is not the same as you. The neighbor is not your household; it's someone else. Yet you are still commanded to love them and to not stand by if something terrible is happening to them.
Yeah, but in some ways, it also calls to be willing to reach across those barriers too.
Right.
Despite those differences, despite the fact that your neighbor may be the one who's the racist, you're also called to engage with them.
Yes, you have to rebuke them. You're supposed
But
to.
also, at the same time, despite them being racist or otherwise, it gets really complicated.
Adam?
Also, Rivka has her hand up.
Oh, please.
Yeah, well, what's become a standard saying is so reflective of this. When you see something, say something. And that's a very hard thing to do sometimes.
Yeah.
When you really see something that is wrong and should not happen, and if you want to say something, that could lead to other things as well that are not so good. But it is still the right thing to do.
So one of the challenges with that line about "you shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him," this can also be used to justify a pro-life protester standing outside of an abortion clinic. They are rebuking their neighbor and don't want them to sin. And honestly, if they think of the fetus as a person, they're not standing idly by the blood of their neighbor, aka the fetus. So the intervention in the lives of other people is a double-edged sword, right? It's on one hand affirming empathy and involvement and caring and even trying to correct them, which is a kind of affirming their dignity that they're worth arguing with to get them to agree with me. But on the other hand, it's also being pushy and being nosy and telling them what to do because I know what's right and they're doing it wrong. And that, violates a sense of privacy and a sense of dignity and a sense of diversity. Because if there's only one right way to do things, then you're going to go around rebuking people all the time. So, this is where it often depends on how it's applied. Right? Rebuking your neighbor could be a good thing, but it could also be imposing your values on them, which at times we are comfortable doing and at times we shouldn't do. So that's where it gets a little more complicated.
The last one about taking vengeance is not holding the sins of the fathers against the children. I have a friend in New Hampshire who's German and her parents were German. She apologized for what happened at the Holocaust. I said, that's not your job to do. We had a discussion, but you do not hold the sin of the parents against the children.
Well, yes and no. I mean, as a country, America certainly has a lot to answer for Jim Crow and slavery. And, the whole discussion of reparations, we're not taking reparations from people who lived 500 years ago. or even 100 years ago. We're taking them against people who live now. So the multi-generational responsibility is, again, a complicated issue. Um, but you're absolutely right that in personal interactions, you don't necessarily have to blame the children for what their parents did, or simply just bear a grudge. Notice part of this is internal. Don't hate your brother in your heart. That's just emotional. That's not how you're treating them in person. And there was another hand in the room.
Yes, Brandy.
Is it necessary to use male language to look at all those scriptures and say, you shall not hate your brother in your heart? Could it be like, you shall not hate your siblings in your heart, or you shall not hate your brothers and sisters in the heart? And you shall not hate your neighbor or your person because of them? Does it actually fail? I really find that language very offensive.
So this is a function of the Hebrew language, which does not have gender neutral terms for many things. So they have brother or sister. They don't have sibling. There's no equivalent. So when you're a translator, you have to decide, do I take it literally? Do I take it figuratively? Or do I do both? And actually, in modern Hebrew, people have started to just say both forms, the male and the female form, instead of just one. You may know that in Spanish and French and other languages, when you have a mixed group, it takes the masculine plural form. And people are trying sometimes to develop new plural forms for a gender neutral approach. It's had mixed impact. And in Israel, sometimes they'll just use both endings on a word, or say everything twice in both the male plural and the female plural to try to get around it. Look, this happens in Yiddish too. What's the standard greeting for people? Shalom Aleichem. That chem ending is the male plural. It would be Shalom Aleichem with an N if it was the female plural. But that's sometimes how languages work. They have gender built into them even more so than English usage. So I dropped this translation in from somewhere else, but there are going to be gender issues with that. And, again, you have to decide, is that a disqualifying feature from this source that's coming from a world of gender binaries and male privilege, or can I read it as the language of its time around vocabulary issues like that? All right, so we're going to move on to some of the context for these passages, because this doesn't appear out of nowhere. After all, you might have noticed what I showed you before started in verse 9. So what's in verse 1 to 8? Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, well, already here we have a problem from a secular perspective. This whole passage, all those rules are not the Constitutional Convention said, or the mass protest said. It's God talking to the prophet Moses, who claims to be writing it all down in a revelation. So already it has one strike on the secular scorecard of how authoritative it should be. Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and tell them, you shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy. If you think of secularism as the opposite of holiness, religiosity, supernatural authority, well, the whole point of this code is sometimes called the holiness code, because it's describing what behavior you need to follow to be holy as God is holy. Set apart, distinct, separate, better, pure, etc. So all of that nice ethical behavior is in the service of a religious concept. And the very first rules he gives in verse 3, each one of you respect his mother and father. We might call that ethical. You will keep my Sabbaths. That seems religious and ritual. Do not turn to idols. Don't make molten gods. Who cares if Hindus have molten gods? Like, the idolatry thing maybe is problematic. You might say that if you treat idols more important than people, but now you're in the interpretation department as opposed to what it's actually saying. The passage goes on, when you accept a sacrifice of peace offerings to Yahweh, offer it so you can be accepted. Eat it the same day you offer it, or the next day. On the third day, you have to burn it with fire. If you eat it on the third day, it's an abomination. Everyone who eats it will bear his sin because he's profaned the holy thing, and the soul will be cut off. It's all this ritual stuff about animal sacrifice and how to do it and when to eat it. It doesn't strike us as particularly holy or inspirational at all. And it's only after all of that that it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not wholly reap the corners of the field or the gleanings of your harvest, and leave them for the poor and all the nice stuff that we started with. So what do we do about the fact that this wonderful ethical stuff comes after all this ritual, religious, supernatural, God-given stuff? How do we harmonize or make sense of that? Or does it not bother us? I'm curious for your thoughts.
Take the good, leave the rest.
Take the good, leave the rest? Other thought? Dave, I see online.
It seems to be connected with temple Judaism first. These are all temple things, and after the second temple was destroyed, everything becomes a temple because the tabernacle is like everywhere, right? And then these other things are latched on almost as if they're later pieces of something that doesn't necessarily flow from it. It's as if it's being made holy by the holy stuff that comes first. That's, I mean, that's way I've always thought of it, possibly.
Yeah, so one possibility is, again, from a secular perspective, we believe the text could have been put together from different sources in different times, even within a particular text, not just the individual book. And so maybe part of it's old and part of it's new, although I would beware the temptation to assume that the stuff we like is new and the stuff we don't like is old. That's a little bit too convenient. Or the stuff we like is the core and the stuff we don't like is the additions that were added on. It's not always that easy, that the good stuff is what we like, and therefore it's the center of what's involved.
I think there's also an opportunity to reinterpret God and Yahweh in a secular way, so that it's not this thing on high that we're supposed to respect and worship, but really more inward and more human.
So Moses' conscience said to him, "Eat the sacrifice on before the third day."
Honestly, he was probably tripping a mushroom, but I'm pretty sure
And that's going to be a good guideline for the rest of humanity.
high or schizophrenic, so. But it doesn't mean that there isn't value in what they saw or what they experienced. Or, I mean, it's also possible to have hallucinations and quote unquote mystical experiences through breath work, through other forms.
Well, see, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead. Someone else said it. So I take a little bit different perspective in that I don't think this happened at all in real life. Okay. Moses is also a character that was written by later writers. They're describing this story. It's like historical fiction. It's set in a time and a place, but it may never have actually happened. And anything in the Hebrew Bible that says Yahweh said, God said, is a person writing God said. Just like Harry Potter never said anything, right? J.K. Rowling wrote that Harry Potter said. So whenever God is described as saying something, it's a person who wrote what God said. And therefore, I'm free, as someone said, to sort of pick and choose. I like this part that the author wrote. I don't like this value that the author wrote. But since it's a person who wrote both of them, I can decide what I like and what I don't. Now, where that gets more complicated is in our current era, where we're not as willing to take the good and dump the bad from a particular author. If somebody puts out a very nasty anti-Semitic Facebook post or Snapchat message, are we willing to say, well, they did a lot of other good things too? We tend to use that as a judgment on them and everything else that they've done. So for a while, J.K. Rowling, who's the author of the Harry Potter series, got a lot of credit for getting young kids to read and including a diverse audience of people and empowering women and all kinds of other details. And then people started to read her books more carefully and saw there were some racist elements to them. And then Rowling herself came out as a very anti-trans personality on social media and in public. And so for many people, that has ruined the Harry Potter books, and they won't consume them. Or think about Elon Musk, who has taken often obnoxious political positions, and again on social media, but he has done more for moving transportation in the private sector to electrification and therefore a more environmental means of getting people around than anybody else has. And, there are people who would never consider buying a Tesla car because of the things that Elon Musk does, where the cars themselves might be very not only economical, but also environmentally sound. So, our style today is not to pick and choose necessarily from people, writers, and public messaging. We tend to want things to be all one or all the other, and that's part of what makes compromise very difficult. But it also means we're treating the Bible differently. Now, maybe, and then I want to open for any comments. It may be that we do treat the Bible differently. It is old. It is sort of a foundational document of Jewish culture. We don't get to just pretend it's not there or write a new one and claim it's as old as the old. We don't get to start from zero. If we're part of inheritors, the heirs of Jewish culture, we have to start with what there is. And this is what there is. So maybe this is our starting point we have to grapple with.
Some things come immediately to mind, what you just said. One is that it really reflects the conversation around art versus artist. And historically, whether that's like J.K. Rowling, Roald Dahl, Miles Davis, others who made incredible pieces of art, but they themselves are not particularly great human beings. And there's often correlation there, given the power that suffering has to drive great, but also terrible actions. So that's something that really kind of resonated for me in what you were saying there.
Well, and there's also, particularly with art versus artists, there's a balance, I feel like, with J.K. Rowling, in Harry Potter, it doesn't specifically go into anti-trans rhetoric.
There are racist first.
There are, but I'm saying like of that issue specifically, whereas if you look at like Looney Tunes or Gone with the Wind or something, right? And now, exactly like if you watch like Looney Tunes or Gone with the Wind or other films or shows of that era, there's often a disclosure at the beginning saying, yeah, there are things in here, they're not great, but to remove them would be just as wrong as they were at the beginning. Like this was still part of this. So I think there's also that kind of question of if you immediately don't cancel like Roald Dahl, how do you approach that with the same problems?
The contextualization.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is what we're doing here. We're taking a look at what is around it. Now, when you're making like marching slogans, it's hard to say, love your neighbor as yourself, despite the ritual context of the verse in Leviticus 19. But like that doesn't make a good chant, So you have to find the right place to highlight the context. So here's another part near the.
One other thing.
Mhm.
Comment about aren't starting from scratch. I 100%, but I would also argue that we're not starting at ground zero with the original text either, because we've got 2,000 years of rabbis arguing over what that text means and trying to recontextualize it in modern context via the Talmud. And in many ways, I would argue that's what it means to be Jewish, is to look at these words, look at, understand, see what we think of them, and what does that mean for us now in this time, in this place.
We'll talk about the interpretation piece in a little bit. One of the challenges is sometimes the rabbi's interpretations is the opposite direction of what we would want. So then we have to grapple with that different layer.
We get to reinterpret ourselves.
Right, of course. Okay, so shortly after the passage at the end that says, love your neighbor as yourself, this wonderful universal message, we see, keep my statutes. You will not crossbreed different kinds of animals. You will not sow your fields with two kinds of seeds. Don't wear a garment made with two kinds of materials. So any cloth, poly blend, blech, right? This is an old rabbinic rule called shatnez, that you can't have different kinds of material in one piece of clothing. What are they talking about here? Why do they care about sowing your field with two kinds of seeds? No, it has to do with keep things separate that should be separate. Part of holiness is keeping things in the right category. There is the foods you're allowed and the foods you're not allowed. There's the behaviors that you're allowed. So they also have a passage, I didn't include it today, but men are not allowed to wear women's clothing. And women are not allowed to wear men's clothing. Now, this is assuming there are rigid categories of women and men and women and men's clothing, right? Because if there's an A or a B, and you can be A or B, but not A and B, or B wearing A, then you clearly have boundaries there. And this is used in all kinds of contexts, not just in terms of transgender issues, but also in the Orthodox religious world to prevent women from wearing a talit or a kippah, because those are men's clothing, beged ish, the clothing of a man, as defined by the ritual practice where men are the ones that wore them historically in Jewish life. Of course, today, if you go into a conservative or reform synagogue, you'll see plenty of women wearing those pieces. So it's not, inherently clear of what is a clothing of a man or clothing of a woman. But this not sowing the field, not wearing the garment is part of a worldview that's very binary. A or B, and keep A separate from B. If you ever celebrated traditional Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, there's a blessing at the end that celebrates making distinctions between day and night, between Israel and the rest of the nations, between the holy and the ordinary. And it's very clear that Israel lines up as light, holy Israel, and then dark, ordinary, and the rest of the week, and not Shabbat. So this is the world of binaries and the world of us and them that we might have some objections to. And then we get something even more obnoxious. If a man lies carnally with a woman who is a slave girl, pledged to be married to another man, and not ransomed or given her freedom, they shall be punished. They shall not be put to death, because she was not free. He will bring his trespass offering to Yahweh, to the door of the tent of meeting. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, for the sin he's committed, and the sin he's committed shall be forgiven him. So here we have an acceptance of slavery, the idea that she's pledged to be married to someone else, but the consequence is different because she's a slave as opposed to being, the whole worldview, the whole conceptual framework for this, the whole concept of women's agency or choice is not mentioned here, and we'll see other examples a little bit later that are even more egregious. So this is the context for love your neighbor as yourself, and then all these other ritual things. And the statutes that are described here are all of them: the good stuff, the ethical stuff, the social justice stuff, and the ritual stuff, the problematic stuff, the offensive stuff. These are all the laws. We have to realize that the word mitzvah in Hebrew means commandment. It's the same root as army, by the way, in modern Hebrew. The tzava is from that same root. Mitzvah means commandment. Now, in modern American vernacular, mitzvah also has the sense of good deed. Right? I did a mitzvah. It doesn't matter if it was commanded or not. It's a good deed. But traditionally, mitzvot were the commandments, and they included both the good stuff and the bad stuff, and the ritual stuff that seems irrelevant to ethics. Traditionally, there were thought to be 613 mitzvot in the Torah, and you hear that number quoted a lot. But I'm curious if you've ever read the list of 613. I encourage you to do it, and then count how many of them you really think are mitzvahs as good deeds, because many of them are not. Many of them only apply to priests. Many of them only apply to temple sacrifices. Many of them are on ritual purity. Many of them might be offensive to you. So people will sometimes trumpet that 613 number as, look at how ethical Jews are. We have 613 commandments.
Yeah,
But
some of them are probably wipe your butt.
I'm sorry. Say it again.
Isn't one of them like around how to properly wipe after using the bathroom? Like, and there's little, it's like very detailed ritualistic things. Like,
And that's not about why there is a blessing for leaving the bathroom successfully.
Isn't it halakha to use your right hand?
Well, that's also there's a Hindu practice around that too, about which hand is appropriate to wipe with. But look, the minutia of rabbinic law is not my department.
Well, I have to say, I'm really interested by this last passage you have up there, because there is something that has gone wrong, and there is a punishment, there's a transgression. But the transgression is for trespass among the man who is a slave girl of, and not the girl who by definition cannot consent to this act.
Right. And we'll see even more egregious examples. There's a reason why many early feminists were opposed to the Bible. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was actually wrote a very scathing essay about the need to reject the Bible. And one of our secular Jewish heroines, Ernestine Rose, was an advocate for emancipation of slaves, for women's liberation, and opposed to the Bible in the 1840s, when women weren't even allowed to speak in public in many places. Ernestine Rose is a fascinating figure. If you haven't learned or read about her, I absolutely recommend finding out more. She's amazing. And she was one of the people who pointed to passages like this in the Hebrew Bible and said, why are you using this as a source of morals? Look at how terrible it is to women. And we'll see a couple other examples as well. So here, further on in Leviticus 19, we get even more things we don't like. You will not cut the hair on the sides of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. This is, by the way, the beginning of that idea of peyot, the curlicues that you'll see in Orthodox Jewish men. These are the corners of your hair. Notice, don't cut the corner of the field and don't cut the corner of your hair. It's the same claim. Do not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor any tattoo marks on you. This is the origin of the Jewish prohibition on tattooing, although it is not true today that a tattoo means you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery. You are allowed to be buried in Jewish cemeteries with tattoos because they are not a ritual for the dead. And this was even before the Holocaust, certainly post-Holocaust. They're not going to tell a Holocaust survivor you can't get buried here because you've got a tattoo. So don't worry about tattoos in Jewish cemeteries these days. However, this is the origin of that sort of cultural taboo. Don't profane your daughter to make her a prostitute. Keep my Sabbaths, reverence my sanctuary. Don't turn to those who are mediums or the wizards. Don't look for any other supernatural power. I am Yahweh your God. Notice how each of the lines ends, I am Yahweh, I am Yahweh, I am Yahweh your God. When I'm in a joking mood, I'll say it sounds like the Wizard of Oz, right?
Yeah.
Why do you have to go get the Wicked Witch of the West's broom? I am the great and powerful Oz. I say so. And pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's fascinating in the context of the first commandment, as far as it's not, you should only worship, you should take no other God before me. And it's very much kind of the marketplace ideas within polytheistic reality, or in which there's a lot of different ideas being put forward. And so even looking at it as I'm Yahweh and this being a human writing it, it's really like trying to be like, yes, this is the way it must be, and this is the truth. All these others, well, you believe them, but they're not as good.
Well, and also remember, I'm a jealous God. Do not look at any other gods.
Yeah.
So it's very much an exclusive worship. Some people describe it as a stage called monolatry, where monotheism is only believing in one God, but monolatry means there may be other gods, but you're not allowed to worship them. You can only worship the one God. And using mediums or wizards or people like that might, is an alternate route to supernatural power, which you're not allowed anymore. It's very exclusive. But again, my point is that in a social justice context, this is irrelevant, other than the treatment of women and sex slavery and sex workers and so on. Like you could broaden an issue from there, but keeping the Sabbath, that's none of our business. And people who want to go to a fortune teller, like it's none of our business. So here's where, again, the full context of Leviticus 19 raises some challenges for social justice purposes. But then here comes the end of the chapter, which is great. You will rise up before the gray-headed and honor the face of the elderly. As I get older, I appreciate this even more. And you will fear your God. And then verse 33, if a stranger lives as a foreigner with you in your land, you will do him no wrong. The stranger who lives as a foreigner with you shall be to you as the native born among you, and you will love him as yourself, for you lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt. This is fantastic. Not just love your neighbor, as it said earlier. Love the stranger who happens to be living near you, and treat him as if he were native born. Because you experienced the trauma, the difficulty of being the foreigner, of being the resident alien, and you know what it's like. So take that experience and do better. It's not like hazing where you suffered and now you get to get the next person suffering. Now it's do better. You suffered. Don't let someone else suffer the way you suffered because you have empathy for what they experienced. Do not wrong them and love them as yourself. Wonderful.
Yeah, that's honestly one of my favorite passages, and also very much for me at least reflects what it means to be the chosen. If we're going to claim to be the chosen people, that to me is what it means. This idea that we've suffered through history and it's our responsibility to ensure that no one else has to go through what we went through.
Yeah. We'll talk about chosenness and its challenges too. So this is wonderful. Now here's where the interpretation becomes a little messy, because when the rabbis read this passage, they took the word for foreigner is ger, gimel resh, usually in English ger. A ger is literally a resident stranger. Lagur is to reside somewhere, not permanently. That's lechiot, to live, but to reside somewhere temporarily is lagur. But when the rabbis interpreted this, through their lens, the word ger became convert, someone who became Jewish. A ger is a convert in rabbinic Judaism, and lehit gayer, which is the verb form, is to convert to Judaism. So they take a universal ethic that says the stranger, whoever they would be, and love them as yourself, and they make it an in-group ethic. The convert should be loved as yourself. And that takes a universal ethic and makes it more parochial. That's where interpretation sometimes can go, and we would think, the wrong direction. And then finally in verse 35, do no unrighteousness in judgment, in measures of length or weight or quantity, no cheating, right? Just balances, fair weights, fair measurements. No, no cheating, and honest economic interactions. Now, Leviticus 20, the very next chapter, begins some of the more problematic context for us. Everyone who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Has anyone in the room never sworn at their parents? I don't know. I have two teenagers. I'll tell you, they would not be alive now if we were enforcing this rule rigidly. So here again is an overly harsh punishment. Now, the positive of honor your mother and father and respect the elderly, that sounds great. When you get the negative punishment for it, then you might say, maybe that's too far. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Again, I'm not a fan of adultery, but consenting adults can do what consenting adults do, and maybe the punishment is a little bit too harsh. And the next part, in verse 13, is one of the more obnoxious ones. If a man lies with a male, as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death, and their blood shall be upon themselves. Indefensible, right? You might notice, though, here it says a male with a male, and it does not include women. And in rabbinic interpretation, they decided that lesbianism was a lower order sin than male homosexuality. And this is actually the real origin for the orange on the Seder plate. So what happened was, in the early 1980s, Susanna Heschel, who was a Jewish theologian, visited Smith College, which is a women's college in Massachusetts. And at their Hillel, they were doing a model Seder, and they actually had a piece of pita bread on the Seder plate. And she said, why did you put pita bread on the Seder plate? And they said, well, we asked a local rabbi, given this verse that says male homosexuality is an abomination and worthy of the death penalty, what's the status of female homosexuality? And the rabbi told them, well, it's a minor sin, like bread on Passover. So they put bread on the Seder plate to say, we're voluntarily committing this minor sin. And Heschel liked the idea of making a statement, but she didn't like the idea of trafing up the Seder plate with actual bread. And so she substituted the orange for the pita bread. But as the story began to spread, as rumors do, it became a story about women's inclusion in Judaism because in the mid-'80s, including lesbians explicitly, was a bridge too far for many people. So that's why you hear the story about a woman belongs as a rabbi like an orange belongs on the Seder plate. It didn't happen. It was originally a story about lesbian inclusion in Jewish life, or broadly, lesbian and gay inclusion in Jewish life, and it morphed into something else. But it comes back to this verse. And this verse is unambiguous and is terribly problematic from a modern social justice perspective. And it's in the very next chapter in Leviticus 20.
Well, the reason we put that in was, you need to perpetuate the family, you need to have children perpetuate the Jewish members of the community, so a man and a man is not going to get you a child.
Well, this is like a one-time offense. This is not saying a man who makes a lifetime partnership with a man shall be put to death. This is, anyone who ever does this, who has, again, broken the rule. A and B are different categories. And notice it highlights a man who lies with a male as with a woman. That's the violation. You've broken the natural order of things, even once. So it's not about propagating the species or the subgenre of the subgenus of the species called Jews. It's about breaking the rule. It's about doing an ick. You did an ick. And therefore, you shall be put to death because you do not stand idly by. You rebuke your neighbor who has done something wrong. I mean, I don't try to defend this passage because from our values, it is appalling. And it's being used today to do terrible things. So I can live with the skeleton in my people's closet of this bad passage. Now, the next verse is, I just include because there's an element of comedy to it. A man who lies with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal and lies with it, kill the woman and the animal. And part of me says, what did the animal do wrong? Why do you have to kill the animal? Aside from the fact that, again, we might not consider this a death penalty, it is, problematic, certainly. But in any case, this is one of those examples of, again, A and B, animal and human, and they should never contact in that way. It also highlights that a man who lies with a woman having her monthly period is also problematic, and they will also be cut off from the people because they've also violated one of these taboo rules. Now, why follow all these rules? Leviticus 20 is sort of the culmination of this holiness code that makes the point. You will keep all my statutes and ordinances and do them in the land, that the land I am bringing you to dwell will not spit you out. Do not walk in the customs of the nation I'm casting out before you. They did all these things, and that's why I hate them. I've said to you, you will get their land, and I will send you in to possess it, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am Yahweh your God who has separated you from all the people. So these holiness practices, whether it's ethics or ritual behavior or animal sacrifices or who's allowed to have sex with whom, all of these are boundaries that mark you as different and better than everybody else. This is why you make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, the clean fowl, unclean fowl, and the clean. Do not make yourselves abominable by animal or bird or anything which the ground teems. I have separated you as from you as unclean. You will be holy to me because I have set you apart from all the peoples that you should be mine. You are different, distinct, and holy on some level has the sense of dedicated as something different and separate. And we can see the fruits of this in what appears in Deuteronomy, a couple of books later, when Yahweh brings you to the land you are about to possess and dislodges the nations before you. Grant them no terms, give them no quarter, doom them to destruction. Do not intermarry with them, do not give their daughters to your sons or take their daughters to your sons. They will make you worship other gods. Instead, here's what you do. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred posts, consign their images to the fire. For you are a people consecrated to Yahweh your God. Yahweh chose you to be his treasured people.
we get a choice in that?
This is going to be hard to run to quote during one of those interfaith marches, right? Take all these people, all these other religions, and wipe them out. Expel the people. I mean, we can see also how this verse is being deployed in certain segments of Israeli society today, right? In treatment of Palestinians. But it's also a sense of absolute purity, the confidence that you are the one true approach to religion and the universe. So here's where we, again, diverge and see the document, or this passage at least of the Hebrew Bible, as an anti-social justice document, encouraging conflict between communities and demanding expulsion, exclusion, and absolutism. As it says in this meme that's often shared, God had the choice. He could have banned slavery or shellfish, and he chose shellfish. When we have a broader perspective, to think of the Bible as an ultimate source of truth, well, we are a dot in the middle of a vast universe. And to think that a God gave this document to just one corner of the universe, or to one part of one corner in the Jewish people, seems chutzpahdik. And if we take a more universal perspective, we realize that the values that we have, this is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is in Leviticus, but also is in the New Testament, is a universal value and applies to all peoples. This was done by Norman Rockwell, by the way, this particular painting. And you can see there's a representative of multiple religions, cultures, and values that are all worthy of treatment as human beings. Another example, which we unfortunately don't have time to go into because we're in our last 10 minutes or so, is the issue of the Jubilee, that every 50 years you proclaim a release of debts, a release of slavery, and a release of property, and everyone goes back to their ancestral lands. You think about land justice, we think about treatment of Native Americans, these echo very strongly, or even just the issue of debts and canceling debts, forgiving debts, student loan debt, credit card debt, etc. And here it says, you can buy from your neighbor according to the years that are left, or increase the price if it's a longer time. It's dealing with the economic complexities of a system of forgiving debts every 7 years, which every 50 years rather, 7 by 7, which sounds great, but has its complications, just as we've seen with student loan debt forgiveness. It sounds great, but has its complications. The land is not sold in perpetuity. The land belongs to God. And that's why he can tell you, go back to where I told you to be and don't sell it. Notice that if your brother becomes poor and sells his possessions, in the end, it will ultimately come back to that clan, to that family where you are released to your property. And if your brother becomes poor, he will live with you like a ger, like an alien, like a temporary resident. Do not take interest from him or profit. You cannot lend your money to him at interest. This is part of the origin of, actually, paradoxically, Jews being money lenders in Christian Europe, because Christians could not lend an interest to Christians, and Jews couldn't lend an interest to Jews, but it was understood by both sides that Jews could lend an interest to Christians, and that's how they fit that money lender role that is essential for a capitalist economy. If you know anything about economics, being able to borrow money and then pay it back later with interest is part of how people are able to build wealth and assets in the economy. And now we get to the part about slavery and the Jubilee, which is what I want to highlight. The brother who's grown poor and sells himself to you, he does not serve as a slave. You treat him with dignity. You do not rule over him with harshness. And he also goes out until the year of the Jubilee, right? He's able to be freed, just like the debts. But as for your male and female slaves, you have from the nations around you, the other people. By the way, the word for nations in Hebrew is goy, goyim. So the goys, the non-Jewish people, they can become male and female slaves. The children of the aliens, those you can buy, and they will be your property. You may make them an inheritance for your children after you, to hold for a possession. Of them you may take your slaves, but of your brothers, do not rule with harshness. So here we have an affirmation in the Bible of not only the existence of slavery, but who should be slaves, and the kind of chattel slavery that we find so appalling in the American context, where people are owned as property that are passed down from generation to generation. So can we quote the Jubilee as a wonderful statement of forgiving debts, of making everybody equal again? I don't think so. Because in the very same chapter, you've got a totally discriminatory slavery system. Those slave owners in the South could quote the Bible to justify what they were doing, because this is what they were doing.
Wouldn't when the slaves converted to Christianity, they'd be falling afoul of that?
Oh, if the slaves converted, it didn't matter. They were the chattel slaves. It's where they were from. That was not a get out of jail free card.
So
Now, I also will
yeah.
point out there are plenty of passages in the Hebrew Bible that are very problematic from a Me Too perspective. If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, they both die, according to this. If there's a young lady who's a virgin pledged to be married to a husband, and he finds her in the city and lays with her, the lady, because she didn't cry being in the city, and the man, because he humbled his neighbor wife, are both stoned to death. The assumption is, in a city, she would cry out if it was a rape. And since she didn't cry out, she's guilty of acquiescing and therefore should be put to death. If they're in a field, you give her the benefit of the doubt that even if she cried out, there was no one to save her, so you kill the man, but not the woman. And these are when a woman is pledged to be married to someone else, but is not yet married. So you give her the benefit of the doubt that she's not promiscuous if they're found in a field, but you don't give her the benefit of the doubt in a city. And then, this is the worst one. If a man finds a lady who is a virgin who is not pledged to be married, grabs her and lies with her, and they're found, then the man who lay with her will give to the lady's father 50 shekels of silver. She becomes his wife because he has humbled her, and he may not put her away all of his days. He's not allowed to divorce her. And what does she think about the whole thing? Doesn't matter. He's punished by a fine given to her father and by being forced to stay married to her the rest of his life. And she is stuck with her rapist. Are there positive women characters in the Hebrew Bible? Yes. There's a prophetess named Huldah who verifies the authority of a revealed scroll in the book of Kings. There's Miriam. There's Deborah. There's even Esther. But it's not a world that affirms women's agency or their independence. You know, if you read the book of Esther, it turns out it wasn't a beauty contest. Because the virgins go visit the king. They stay there for 12 months. Why 12 months? To make sure they're not pregnant. And then they go to the king's house. They go in the evening to the king's house, and the next day they go to another women's house. What do you think happened overnight? Was it the talent show? Well, maybe, depending on what talent you're looking at. But it's clearly a tryout. This is not how we tell the story to kids. And Esther pleases the king more than anybody else. So it's not just beauty. It's a world of oppressing women. And we talked about the interpretation of the text. That may be a way to save it. And after all, there are modern ways to retell the story. It doesn't only have to be the traditional ways. And there are other sources too. Isaiah 58, if you've never read it, is totally worth looking at. It's a wonderful statement of doing justice in the world. Don't fast to afflict yourself, but act in the world. In fact, in the anthology that CSGO published called Apples and Honey, which is a collection of resources for the high holidays, this is there, and it's a wonderful statement of social justice coming out of the prophets. So there are plenty of examples of these values. In the end, we have to find the balance between our values and biblical values. There are going to be times they overlap, right? Loving the stranger, caring for the widow and the orphan, not oppressing the stranger because you were strangers, even if it never happened. If you were never in Egypt, and that's myth, the mythos, the story is of value, but we're not going to assume that our values are synonymous with the values of the Hebrew Bible. That's time for me. Any last comments or questions?
Well, in the context of this, I'm curious on your thoughts of the lawsuits filed, particularly by Orthodox Jews, against anti-abortion laws as a violation of religious freedom.
It's actually not by Orthodox Jews, it's by conservative and Reform Jews.
Oh, okay, I thought some of the Orthodox were signed on side.
I mean, there may be some Orthodox Jews signing on too, but many of the leaders of this are Orthodox and conservative rabbis and leaders who are saying that our religious tradition does not define a child at the time you're defining it, and privileges the mother's life over the life of the fetus. So much so that in a circumstance where the child is stuck, and even in the birth process, or it's threatening the life of the mother, you're allowed to consider the fetus as a pursuer, like somebody with a knife chasing her. And if someone was chasing her with a knife, you could kill the pursuer to save the person who's threatened. So you can terminate the fetus to save the life of the mother, even up to the point of birth. So the life and health of the mother are very important considerations. And the fetus is not considered a full person until birth, actually. So Jewish tradition takes a very different approach from Catholic dogma, which says that the soul is enshrined in the entity as soon as fertilization of the egg happens. Real from conception. That's not the Jewish perspective. I don't know how far they're going to get because of the current composition of the Supreme Court and the other courts that are going to be hearing the case. It's an interesting strategy. It's analogous to that gay marriage strategy I mentioned of liberal religious groups saying you're imposing your values on mine. The challenge is that the current court has a very narrow understanding of what establishing a religion means, and they are letting go a lot of things that 50 years ago would not have been allowed in a separation of religion and government context. So, we're stuck with the court we have, unfortunately, until things change. And I don't know that those arguments are going to go very far. We'll see.